If we set aside touristic preferences, Portugal is not currently considered one of Europe's economic giants. However, surprisingly, just 2.5 centuries ago, the situation was entirely different. Back then, Portugal was a flourishing empire, respected and even feared. It owned all of Brazil, as well as large colonies in Mozambique, Angola, the Azores, Goa, Macau, and Malacca. The Portuguese fleet was among the most powerful in the world. Looking at all this, it seems that nothing could have destroyed such greatness. But everything changed on November 1st, 1755. In just a few minutes, 85% of Europe's largest city was reduced to ruins. Waves up to 20 meters high struck the coast, and a terrible fire destroyed the remaining parts of the city. Today, this event is known as the Lisbon earthquake, but it was more than just an earthquake. It was an event that changed the course of history for not only Portugal, but the whole of Europe. Every great empire has its capital, a heart where power, culture, and faith are concentrated. For Portugal, that city was Lisbon. Situated at the very edge of the old world and swept by ocean breezes, this city of white stone impressed everyone who saw it. It was called the African city because of the many slaves arriving from the colonies, but Lisbon had another nickname, the City of God. At that time, there was no more Catholic city in Europe than the Portuguese capital. Within the city limits, there were 40 parish churches, 121 chapels, 90 monasteries, and 150 registered religious brotherhoods. And the people of Lisbon were generously rewarded for their faith. Hygiene conditions in Lisbon were better than in Paris, and being the third most important port city in Europe, allowed the residents of Lisbon to enjoy exotic foods, fabrics, and other pleasures. Among Europeans, there was even a popular saying, "Qui no ha visto Lisboa non ha visto cosa boa." He who has not seen Lisbon has not seen beauty. But neither wealth nor faith could protect the brilliant Portuguese capital from the natural disaster that struck the city on a festive autumn morning. On November 1st, Catholics celebrate one of the most important holidays of the year, All Saints' Day. Lisbon was no exception, and by the start of the service, all the city's churches were packed. People crowded both in the side naves and on the steps of the churches. Priests donned white vestments for the occasion. It was around 9:20 a.m. when the first tremor struck. The earth shook, and a dull, powerful roar could be heard, sometimes resembling thunder. The ground's vibrations, initially small and resembling a light tremor, quickly escalated. Items in houses began to fall, and people found it hard to stay on their feet. Cracks began to appear in the walls of buildings, with bricks and stones flying out of them. According to eyewitnesses, the strong rumbling was clearly audible only during the first minute of the tremors. Then, it was drowned out by other sounds of the catastrophe, the crash of falling objects and collapsing walls, the roar and howl of terrified animals, and cries for help. To most residents, well acquainted with biblical stories, it seemed as if the end of the world predicted in the apocalypse had arrived. Everyone tried to save themselves, forgetting about their closest loved ones. As noted by Portuguese writer and historian R. Tavares in his book dedicated to the Lisbon earthquake, the theme of excessive selfishness later became a subject of extensive debate, both in print and public discussions, as the sudden catastrophe exposed the human essence, revealing the true value of claims to virtue and mercy. Ironically, most buildings on Rua Formosa, where Lisbon's brothels were located, suffered very little damage, as did their inhabitants. In contrast to the thousands of parishioners who perished in the churches, this widely known fact greatly perplexed advocates of piety and became a central point in the ensuing discussion throughout enlightened Europe about the cruelty or goodness of God. When the seismic tremors finally ceased, the survivors began to recover, trying to understand what had happened. The familiar appearance of the city had changed beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared, and narrow streets were filled with debris. People struggled to make their way toward the harbor, hoping to find refuge on the ships. Many descended to the Tagus River, where the water level had dropped so much during the earthquake that in many places the riverbed was exposed. All the ships in the harbor felt the sea quake caused by the impact of seismic waves on the bay's floor. About an hour after the earthquake, a tsunami came from the ocean. According to eyewitness reports, there were a total of 3 waves, with the second being the largest. It reached a height of 5 and 6 meters, tore ships in the harbor from their moorings, and threw hundreds of fishing boats and skiffs onto the shore. The streets of Baissa, Lower Town, adjacent to the harbor, were flooded up to 250–300 meters. However, thanks to Lisbon's location on the slopes of hills that gradually descend to the mouth of the Tagus, the tsunami's contribution to the overall destruction of the city was relatively small. But the retreat of the third wave did not mark the end of the catastrophe that befell Lisbon. As evening approached, the main danger for the survivors came from the fires that broke out under the rubble, which often occur in densely built urban areas during earthquakes. The palaces, churches, and residential houses of Lisbon were primarily made of stone, but they contained wooden floors, doors, and furniture. Plenty of fuel for the fire sparked by overturned candles, church chandeliers, and unextinguished home hearths. Many people perished in the flames and smoke, unable to escape through the debris. The most terrible fate awaited the wounded, whom the fire reached inside the buildings. For instance, in the Hospital of All Saints, 400 patients burned to death. The Royal Palace, the Patriarchal Cathedral, and the Lisbon Opera House, which had opened just 7 months before the earthquake, were completely destroyed by fire. Countless artistic and cultural treasures that had accumulated in Lisbon over the previous 2 centuries were lost to the flames. The fires continued until nightfall, with no means or people available to extinguish them. Surprisingly, the royal family was unharmed during the earthquake, but the shock of the experience was so intense that King Dom José I did not wish to rebuild the destroyed palace. For several years following the disaster, the royal family lived in a field camp on the eastern outskirts of the city, at the foot of the Ajuda Hill, where the famous royal tents were erected. The total number of victims of the Lisbon disaster remains a subject of debate, primarily due to the lack of accurate data on the city's population. Figures range from 10,000 to 90,000 people. Unfortunately, no precise counts were conducted. No matter how great the number of those who perished in the Lisbon earthquake, the majority of the population survived, though they were left without nearly any means of subsistence. Urgent and decisive measures were needed to establish basic living conditions. Fortunately, the government had a person who could take responsibility for restoring normal life for the residents of the capital and its surrounding areas. This was the royal minister Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, who went down in history as the Marquis of Pombal. His common sense and indomitable energy greatly contributed to the swift initiation of rescue operations. His response to the king's question about what should be done in such a widespread disaster became widely known: bury the dead and feed the living. The primary task to prevent the threat of a plague epidemic was to bury the bodies of the deceased. A problem arose in negotiating an expedited procedure for the burial rituals established by the church with the Catholic prelates. No less urgent was the task of quickly restoring the city's food supply, for which measures were taken to urgently bring in grain and other products from nearby provinces. Merchants were ordered, under the threat of severe penalties, to sell their supplies at prices that were in effect before the earthquake. Another crucial task was the fight against crime. Lisbon was swept by a wave of looting, robbery, and violence. The scale of the crime was so great that extreme measures had to be taken to curb it. A royal decree mandated the execution of looters and robbers caught red-handed on the same day, without trial or investigation. Gallows were erected in all parts of the city and were immediately put to work. After being removed from the gallows, the criminals' heads were cut off and piled into pyramids on platforms. Only through such extraordinary measures was it possible to stop the looting and violence in the devastated city. Not as urgent, but equally important, was the problem of clearing the streets and restoring the transportation network in the affected areas. To address this, a royal decree ordered the use of cannons to demolish all damaged buildings, regardless of ownership. Amidst all these issues, the restoration of the nation's capital had to proceed somehow. Thus, on December 5th, 1755, a reconstruction plan for Lisbon was submitted to the king by military engineer General Manuel da Meia.
The general proposed 5 options for the city's reconstruction, differing in their degree of radicality. The first 4 were based on what was, even by modern seismological standards, a reasonable approach to the recurrence of strong earthquakes. The general pointed out that the earthquake that occurred is not a harbinger of a new one, and since no such phenomena have occurred in Lisbon in previous years, there is no reason to expect them to recur in the foreseeable future. The 4th option was ultimately adopted. According to this plan, the city needed to be redesigned and the streets made geometrically regular, with private houses, as well as destroyed public buildings and temples, receiving a new location. In this way, the Marquis of Pombal literally saved Lisbon thanks to his innovative and bold decisions. In addition to this, he also attempted to investigate the causes of the earthquake and the possibilities of predicting such tragedies in the future.
Other countries were engaged in the same inquiries because the waves from the earthquake were felt as far as Madrid and Western Europe. The pendulums in German churches swayed by themselves, and icons fell from their places. Intellectuals and thinkers all over Europe immediately understood that the disaster that befell Portugal was a cause for deep reflection on the nature of existence, on what in this world belongs to God and what to society. Philosophy began to change, transforming from romanticism into pragmatism, and philosophers started actively to conflict with the church. In clerical circles, the idea of divine wrath prevailed, implying that the catastrophe occurred because of the sins of the people of Lisbon, their insufficient devotion and diligence in faith. The intellectual elite of the enlightened 18th century could not agree with this. In The Poem on the Lisbon Disaster, published as early as December 1755, the French thinker and writer Voltaire argued against those who considered the earthquake a punishment from God. Did Lisbon, a smaller city, commit more sins than London or Paris, which are steeped in pleasure? Lisbon is destroyed, and in Paris they dance. Rousseau asked similar questions. All of Kant's early works were based on the idea that any attempt to justify God is pitiable and pointless, that after the tragedy of Lisbon, justifying God is not only foolish but unethical. For the first time in history, the question of the existence of God arose so sharply. A contradiction emerged in people's minds. For centuries, humanity was considered the progenitor of chaos, while God embodied universal reason and harmony. But on November 1st, 1755, the Christian God acted illogically and cruelly. One question led to another, and all of them remained unanswered. Is God really so bloodthirsty that he requires human sacrifices obtained in such a merciless way? And is it ethical to continue justifying God? In fact, the events of 1755 gave rise to atheism as we observe it today.